And then we're gonna cut to this. Okay, sorry about the pounding. Fluorine. Okay. So I keep saying it's going to be less complicated. This is the last thing that we're going to talk about as far as some complicated stuff, and it has to do with the referent group distribution question. And the issue really is something that occurs because of economics. So it wasn't like the previous chapter where we actually tried to trace who the winners and losers were relative to the actual project because it's going to cut them off from something or anything like that. We're going to actually now look at some economic implications, and it has to do again with market prices. And it doesn't have to do with the fact that we have to use shadow prices, we don't know how to value. That's not the issue. The issue really becomes a situation where we have to examine what happens to the prices of the project inputs or outputs as a result of the project. It has nothing to do with problems in the marketplace that somebody tried to correct, or we're going to try to account for in our analysis where we're trying to bring in some of these non-market costs like pollution, or deal with distorting things that we're trying to correct, like subsidies that have been enacted or taxes that have been enacted that are messing up equilibrium. But we're really going to look at this situation where we're looking at just what happened to market prices, just straight across the board. So it's pretty straightforward economics. Although if you're not an economist, some of these curves may kind of throw you for a loop. So if it's an input or output that's traded in a world market, which some are not. In general, we like that because if that happens, when you have a community that does a project, the amount of change that they'll bring about in the actual overall supply and demand at the world level is just so minuscule that it won't matter. But again, that means that you have to have a very healthy world market, and the tendency is to not have that. The tendency is to have situations where we're always trying to protect our markets at home. And so this is why we have to have trade agreements, because in order to not protect ourselves, we need to make sure that our trading partners are going to be open also. So we have a lot of this political wrangling going on, so often we don't have free, unfettered world markets. So if we had free, unfettered world markets, a lot of this wouldn't even be necessary because things would automatically adjust, but we just don't have that. We don't like it a lot because we think somehow, I've always been a coal miner, I want to be a coal miner until I retire, this sort of thing, or we need this market in the US. This is kind of what we have with the food situation. We cannot just import all of our food because that's a bad thing. We can't import all of our gas. That's a bad thing. So we need to keep our own markets going. The next thing is if this project is super, super small, it won't really impact an economy that's larger. For example, if it's a project in the US, in one county, it's probably not going to influence the US market because it's going to be really small relative to the size of the economy in which it was undertaken. But if you're looking at national projects, like we talked about yesterday with the idea of we want to have a subsidy for people buying electric cars or something, that may actually influence a market because it's a nationwide situation. And so that might actually change the position of the supply and demand curves or where equilibrium is occurring. So if the market price of a project output falls, so you're doing a project, you're producing more of a certain thing, and because you're producing more of it, the price comes down because we're actually increasing the amount we supply, or the supply actually increased, then the additional output needs to be valued. So let's just kind of look at how we do this. So we do it kind of following up on this idea of the potential for Pareto optimality. So for example, again, what are we talking about? The price falls, right? So if the price falls from P0 to P1, is this consumer better off or worse off? They're actually going to be better off. They're going to buy the same amount of this good because they don't respond to price. The classic example is insulin for diabetes, medicine where you have to buy it, so you have to spend the money. And so if we have a situation where the price falls, this consumer is actually better off. They're better off because they now actually have freed up some money, this amount of money in here, that they now don't have to spend from this thing. So this project, and we see this often when we discuss drug prices, that, oh, in third world countries, the prices are very cheap, but in America, they're very expensive. The reason why they're very expensive in the US is because most people will get the money to buy it. So the firm makes more money in the US by keeping prices up, but if you're in a poor country, then you're going to do better if you keep prices lower, because you won't see this ability to always pay the price like this. No matter what the price, this is how much I need, this is how much I'm going to buy. In poorer countries, they're going to respond. In the US, they're probably going to be a situation where they're not going to respond. They're going to buy the same amount. So why would we charge them less? We'll charge them more. So if we were going to compensate this person, in fact, to make this person the same well-offness after this price drop right here, then you'd have to actually take money away from them, because they are actually buying the same amount, but they now have what we call more income, or the income effect of a price drop was I now have more money to buy everything else. So this person is just as well off at P0 as P1 as far as the amount that they get to consume. What they're losing is this extra income from not having to pay so much for their drugs. So in that situation, that's a potential for some sort of compensation from this person to someone else who's actually losing as a result. Maybe they don't have the ability that this person, or maybe they're in a different country or something, if we were looking at something trans country. So this is kind of what we're talking about. And that's a case where this is purely an income effect. But I'm just going to tell you that very rarely do we have the same ability to keep buying the same amount. Usually that income effect is also accompanied by another effect, which we're going to talk about, which is the substitution effect. So here's a case where the amount you're buying increases, but in the previous case, of course, it did not. You bought the same amount. In this case, you're increasing the amount you're buying when the price goes down, but you're doing this for two reasons. One, because every time the price goes down, you essentially have more income, because the same thing you were buying yesterday is now cheaper. So you have more money to spend on everything, including on this good. And then secondly, as this good becomes cheaper, then you will have a substitution effect when the price drops, where you'll substitute this for other things, because this is now cheaper relative to everything else. The only price that's changing is the price of this good. So you're saying, oh, well, this is cheaper. It's not a perfect substitute for that, but I'm willing to buy more. So there's two reasons when you have a downward sloping demand curve that you buy more. Number one is, as the price goes down, you actually have more income, because you buy the same stuff for less money. So you have more income to spend. And secondly, as the price goes down, you will switch to this good and away from the more expensive alternatives that you've considered. So this makes it very complicated if you're a professional economist, because we have two different types of demand curves. We have the Hicksian one where you're just taking out that income effect, and the Marshallian one which you're including the income effect. But thank goodness in general, those differences are small unless you have really large price changes and you spend really a lot of money on one thing. Like rent, if you really spend a lot of money on one thing and the price of rent drops a lot, you might have a really, really significant income effect, but not much of a substitution effect. You still rent the same apartment, but you have a lot more money. Or if the price goes up, your apartment is much more expensive, you're having a very significant income effect because you're spending so much of your money on rent. And this is what's happening now with these rents being so expensive. So unless we're in that situation, and sometimes we are, we don't really worry about it. And thank goodness in this class, we're not going to worry about it because it's very complicated. If we were professional economists, we would spend a lot of energy on this. But for this class, suffice it to say, we're just going to do some simple analysis of what happens when there's price changes. So you can get a feel for how they affect the different members of the referent group, because that's what we're talking about. It affects the distribution. So if a fall in price results in a decrease in costs, then that decrease is a net benefit and it's included in the efficiency net benefits. So if things become cheaper, then that's a benefit because we're going to be better off. And if it doesn't, then we're really transferring from one group to another. And we call this a transfer from consumers to firms. And we have a term that we use called consumer surplus and producer surplus. And so you may have a situation where if a price falls, consumers are better off, but producers are not better off because they're losing. So you're transferring it from the consumers to the firms. In the referent group, this matters. If the firms and the consumers are in the referent group, this will matter. However, or if the firms are outside and the consumers are inside, then you have to adjust accordingly because the firms outside will be affected as they take their profits and go home. They will have less profits. And the consumers will have more what we call consumer surplus. And at the end of the day, it would net out in a net efficiency analysis because an efficiency analysis is a global analysis. We don't care that that firm went home with the money. If they went home for less, these consumers ended up with more. That wouldn't really be a problem because in the efficiency analysis, this all nets out. It only really matters for the referent group. So that's why we're talking about it, because we're talking about distributional things. It does matter. So if the fall in the product price is not matched by a fall in production costs, then we have this situation. If the private firm is not a member of the referent group, then the efficiency net benefits fall, but the private net benefits fall even more. So the referent group net benefits then rise. So the consumers benefit at the expense of the firm, but we're happy in the referent group because the winners were on our side. The consumers are on our side, so we're happy. At the efficiency level, it kind of is a bit of an issue, but for the referent group, we're happier because our net benefits go up. So in that case, we really have a bit of an efficiency problem, but the referent group is happy. On the other hand, if the private firm is a member of the referent group, then efficiency net benefits are the same as the referent group net benefits. And basically, then the referent group net benefits would fall because the lower value is placed on the extra output by the project. So you're really bringing it home there at the referent group level. So Oh, I wonder why that does that. I keep trying to take those out. So we have something called the Calder-Hicks criterion to assess potential Pareto improvement. So again, we've talked about this before. We're not going to do this on any homework, but we still want to figure out if the gainers can compensate the losers. And this really tells us if our distribution has been affected in a positive way or in a negative way. And the reason why we do this, again, is because we're trying to look at these distributional issues. Where are the winners? Where are the losers? And we're not saying that they have to compensate. We're just saying, is this something where the winners make enough that they could compensate the losers, and therefore our distribution of benefits is not necessarily made worse off? So that's what we're really trying to explore. And what we're going to actually do is measure these areas under the demand curves and under the supply curves, or actually above the supply curves, which are called consumer and producer surplus. So let's just get right to it because it's confusing, I know. So if I want to change the course from being online to being a lecture course, then every person that gains from this, oh yes, I'm much happier to have it as a lecture course in the spring. So the winners say how much money I could take away from them and leave them still as well off as before the change. And the losers would have to decide how much I would have to pay them. So again, we have that Pareto optimality potential evaluated just like we did before when we were doing chapter 1, the positives and the negatives. And if across everybody you still come up with a positive, then we have potential Pareto improvement. So let's actually look at something. So here we have a demand curve. Now I want to define for you consumer surplus. So if the price is here, right here at P0, we're going to be right here on the demand curve at point A. So we're going to pay this much, and we're going to consume this much trips per year on the bridge, and each consumer is going to pay this much. And everybody that's up here, you notice, was willing to pay more, but they're only having to pay P0. That means they're getting what we call a consumer surplus. So here is the consumer surplus when price is at P0, because every one of these people up here above P0 is telling us by being above P0, that's how much this is worth to me. I'm willing to pay more than P0. But if you're selling it for P0, I actually get what we call a consumer surplus, a benefit. So if we were here and we decided, and this was the annual cost of trips per year, and we build a bridge which reduce the cost of our trips because it's a shorter distance, we're going to build a bridge so we don't have to drive so far. So if that reduced the cost of our trips, then we would be down here. So we would have more people all the way out to sea consuming this. So we're actually increasing the amount of consumer benefit from this bridge in this community by this area right here. So this much more is a rectangle, and this much more is a triangle. So we can tell what's the annual benefit derived by consumers from this bridge. And that's what this is right here, PACP. So P0 ACP is the total area, which is difficult to figure out. So we break it up into two pieces. First, there's the area of this rectangle. So the area of this rectangle is the height, which is P0 minus P1, and the length, which is Q, right? The length here is Q. So it's P0 times P1, the height, times the length, which is Q. So that's the area of this square right here. And then we have to get the area of this rectangle, and we'll know the increase in annual benefits derived by consumers from building this bridge. So this area right here is again the distance between Q0, Q1. And this is again the P0, P0, P1, Q1, Q0, divided by 2 because it's a triangle. So you have to divide the area by 2. So that's how you figure out the annual value derived by consumers from the bridge. So if you're looking at bunches of different projects, you really need to go in there and decide the benefits to the consumers in your area from these projects. Mostly this occurs in very large, again, large scale projects. So municipalities should have the ability to forecast these demands. And we're not talking about cost yet. We're just talking about the benefits to consumers. And you can even do traffic studies. I think Carl Kim used to do a lot of traffic studies to see which groups were benefiting and which groups were paying more costs from some of these traffic distances. So you can actually figure out which consumers are benefiting, how much they're benefiting by tracking the areas that are going to be served by the bridge. And you can see then which consumers are not benefiting. So they're basically staying the same. And these are the consumers that are benefiting. The consumers that are not benefiting are not usually paying anything unless you're raising taxes. If you're raising taxes to pay for the bridge, then they will be having a negative cost associated with that, as will the consumers that are using the bridge, because the tax base will pay equal amounts, not depending on where they live. So that's kind of what you do. And your first homework problem is really looking at this. And it's all really geared at measuring these areas under these curves and seeing the kinds of changes. So here it is, the benefit from the bridge to the consumers. This area right here, which is defined by this right here. And then this area right here, which is defined by this area right here. So it's pretty simple in this class because I give you the demand curves. If you do not have the demand curves, then this gets very sticky. So we usually go to secondary sources to find out what these demand curves are, or at least some sort of estimate of how they're sloped so that we can see what these responses are to these price changes. Because we can figure out actually the price changes if you actually do studies on, like Carl Kim did on transportation, how long does it take, how many miles. You can calculate the cost of the car and what you're actually paying for those miles. And we do that every day with the federal mileage allowance. That's an estimate of how much it costs us to drive our car. So if you cut 5 miles off the commute on average, then you can get to this P1 price. And that's usually how that's done. So now let's suppose that we decide we're going to put a bridge toll. What does that do? So what we have here is still the P0, P1. And we're going to have a toll right here at P2. So what's going to actually happen? The annual benefit to consumers is still here. A, F, except it stops at P2. It doesn't go all the way to C now. It stops right here. So the benefit to consumers decreased because you had a toll. And then the toll is actually right here. That's the area that's the toll. So that amount, which is a pretty simple thing to figure out, because you have the height of it times the length of it, which is Q2, and the height of it is P2 minus P1. So that amount will actually be a transfer of benefits of the bridge to the municipality or whatever referent group structure is controlling things. So that's kind of how you do it. And all projects can be looked at this way. For our example, I think our homework, there's only 3 questions. And the first one is basically this question where you're asked to figure out what's the benefit to consumers if you have a bridge, and they give you the shape of the demand curve. If you don't have the shape of the demand curve, that's where the consultant has to put out a lot of energy. A lot of times you can find estimates from secondary sources, So you know how fast that curve slopes down, and that lets you predict what that price change would be that would be associated with that demand. So let's just look at, because I've been talking about it, the effect of a worker training program. Let me just say that this is one of the main reasons, this what we're going to talk about next is one of the main reasons that we end up with things like labor unions, the American Medical Association, the Bar Association. All of those are an attempt to restrict supply. And here's exactly the reason. If we train more workers, we're here, and we train more workers, so we actually increase the supply of skilled workers. What impact does that have in the labor market? You actually have a decrease in the wage rate. So even though I keep saying, oh, we need more worker training, as you move them up, there will be this kind of secondary effect of the wage rate kind of dampening down. And that is something that we have to consider. This is why the American Bar Association makes you pass tests. This is why the American Medical Association has licensing. This is why we have unions, labor unions. Union labor usually costs more. They have restrictions on how you can get in. And the reason why is because they like to keep that wage rate up here rather than down here. Because if you move it down to B, what essentially happens is that the employers, which is the source of this demand, actually gets a benefit, an increase in their surplus, just like the last time, from here to A to B to W1. They get the benefit by paying reduced wages because they have more workers. And that is something that does not sit well, particularly with unions. So they will attempt to restrict some supply because they don't want to drive down the salary for their workers. So that's the benefit to employers. And then you also have a benefit to the cost to the original skilled workforce, right? So they're going to drop wages from here. So this is a negative drop, right? From 0 to W1, that's a negative. And so here, 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 and here is the cost to them. So what we're doing is divvying up the benefits that went to the employer. Remember, that was here. The employer got these positives, and it was at the cost of the workers right there, right there. And then the trainees are FBG, right? So they're getting this benefit right here because they would not have gotten those jobs otherwise. So you notice this area kind of cancels out this area. And this is a benefit to them. This is a benefit to the employers. This is a cost by the trainees. And the rest of this cost that goes to the employers is really borne by the original skilled workforce. Remember, this is the original skilled workforce. This is their cost. This is the cost to or the benefit to the employer. And then what's left over is the trainees situation, where they're actually also getting a benefit. Oh, where's my cursor? FBG. So the trainees are getting this, the employers are getting that, and who's paying the cost? A lot of it is being paid by the original skilled workforce, although overall there is a total benefit. And that is F, this little triangle, B, G, right? So FBG is our actual net benefit because the trainees get a benefit and the employers get a benefit. And then we have to subtract out the cost paid by the original workers. So you have to really look at this kind of stuff, because I bet you never really thought of unions as being something that basically restricted the supply of workers. And the reason they do is because the person getting the negative charge is the original skilled workforce. The trainees are coming out with a positive, and the employers are coming out with a positive. So the new workers that you're employing come out positive, and the employers come out positive, but the cost is borne by those original skilled workforce. So that's really a problem when you are looking at situations like Hawaii, where you have a very dominant interest in the unions. It's very much a union state, so that's going to be an issue. And that's why a lot of people don't, well, not a lot of people, let's just say employers don't like unions, and people that want to enter the skilled workforce get a little discouraged by unions, because they're giving up a benefit. There's not a lot of room for them to get in, and the employers don't like them. And I'm sure you've noticed that there's a lot of anti-union sentiment among employers, and this is why. They want to train up workers as fast as possible because it increases the supply and reduces the cost. So they actually get what we call consumer surplus. When you increase supply and decrease the wages, this employer gets some surplus because they're on the demand side. So that surplus goes up and the suppliers get less. And so this is why this becomes very complex. And I'm sure you never thought about it. So there is not a problem on this, but I just wanted to demonstrate how deeply this has to get analyzed to really come up with a good reference group analysis. This is very difficult because you have situations where you wouldn't think that a union would be bad. They're there to protect workers, but the workers they're really there to protect are their union members, not non-union members. So that becomes a bit political. So again, worker training program, skilled wage rate falls, employers benefit, original skilled workforce loses because the wage rate falls and they pay a cost, and the trainees get a job where they didn't have one before, so they also get a benefit. So when you net out the total benefit, again, the net is still positive, but the group that's going to lose is the original skilled workforce. And this is something that bothers them. They want to amass power to prevent that from happening. And that's why they originally started becoming interested in unions, because they wanted power against that employer, particularly for less skilled jobs. But it's not necessarily something that's bad for them to gain power, but you have to be careful because, you know, it's always a balance. You need to employ young people. I think that's why in Morocco and China, they have a very, very low retirement age, like 50, 55. Women have to retire very young so that they can make room for new workers. So this becomes very difficult for some projects. Not so much for the bridge project because it was just consumers in the municipality. This becomes difficult because you're talking about labor. So let's look at a simpler one that's probably less controversial, the benefits of an irrigation project. So we're going to increase the supply of water. Increase the supply of water. So the consumer surplus goes up because before we were here, we were only getting this much benefit. So now we're getting this much benefit. So the consumers really benefit from getting that water. And who are the consumers? Well, if it's an irrigation project, then it's really the farmers, right? So we can value the extra output of food. So we can value the extra output of food. So that would be B, P0, P1, just like we did before, it would be this area in here. So that would really be the value of the food that they grow with this extra water. Another way to measure it would be the value of the extra income, which is who owns the water that you're selling, the supplier of the water. So we can look at also at the supplier side. So if you get stuck and you can't do the demand side, sometimes you look at the supply side. So the water authority makes some money and the landowner makes money because they produce more. So you can go ahead and look at those areas. Let's look at what those look like. Go back. So the landowner gets P1, C, P1, C, Q1. So the landowner or the water authority gets this. Minus this little area here, right? Because that's consumer surplus, but they were selling this much, right? Before they were selling this much, now they're selling this much. So they started initially selling this much. Now they're selling this much. So you got to subtract out this little area because they're not making that anymore, but hopefully they're making more because the area of this one is bigger than the area of that one. So originally they were making this much money. Now they're making this much money. And you have to subtract this one out, and hopefully this one is smaller than that one, which it looks like it is. So that's how much the water authority makes. And then the landowner, again, makes that surplus. So we're not really measuring the value of the food, the output, but we're measuring the value of the income. So whoever is owning that land will make extra profits. So you can measure it in the term of profits or income or output. So either way, if we add that all together, we're going to come up with the same exact amount we did before, which was B, C, Q, 0. So we're getting that much more stuff produced, food. So you can see this is pretty complicated. Thank goodness I'm not going to ask you all that. In fact, we're probably not even going to do this one because it's just getting a little bit confusing. And we're not really doing it on our homework, but you see how complex it is. So if you really wanted to do this, you're really going to have some information about those supply and demand curves. And so if this is something you wanted to do as a consultant, it would be a little bit more challenging if you didn't have an economist to help you identify some of these curves. If you're just doing a small project in a small community, it's probably not going to change the prices. So you'd be safe. But if you're doing national level, then this is why they have all these macroeconomists estimating all these curves all the time, or even microeconomists at the state level. And that's why it seems also complicated. But the only reason we're looking at it is because whenever you have a change in the price of the output and nothing else changes, as we went back, as we said before, let's go back to the beginning. If the prices of project inputs or outputs do not change, then we're fine. But if the market price of the output from the project falls, then we got to value that additional output. So that's very important to understand that that's an economic effect, and it translates into a distributional effect, as we just talked about. Do the employers benefit? Do the consumers benefit? Who actually is benefiting? Because if we don't really know that, we may be actually, again, doing projects that have implications that we're not really feeling good about. So we really need to track some of this stuff. And this would have been something that we probably would have done when we looked at these solar tax rebates. We should have actually looked at that. And we would have concluded that it, in fact, is going to be a group that benefits, and the bulk of those people are on the higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum, and we would have figured this all out. But because we're not thinking like that, then we end up with these unintentional consequences which cause problems. So this is something we need to really pay attention to, particularly the labor situation. If we're looking at training people up, when you bring in new people that will work for a lower wage, the existing people are going to be upset because they're going to take the loss. The employers won't care. So this is going to lead to some issues, I think, in the social strata, because you're going to have the distributional effects such that the group that's paying the cost is not going to be happy about paying the cost. So we have to kind of be prepared for that. And the employer should be happy about it, although it may be that they're not, but they do get benefits. So this is this type of stuff that complicated, I know, but definitely something we need to think about. So I know it's a lot to absorb. I keep saying, oh, this is the last time it's going to be all this economics. But for your problems, it's not so bad because they actually describe to you the shape of these demand curves. So you've just got to figure out how much the price went down. And in most cases, to be honest with you, the federal government does supply information about how fast these demand curves go down. They estimate this sort of thing. So you should be able to figure it out if it's not too complex. But if it's really complex at the national scale, then it probably would be too much for us to learn how to do in this class. But if it was just community level or even maybe state, like Hawaii, for example, if we're importing all this food, we don't really even set the price of food ourselves. We go LA plus transportation. So for us, it wouldn't probably have a big impact for that. So that would not be so bad. Other markets, maybe it would matter more because maybe we would have a price drop. But most cases, we don't produce any of our own stuff. We're not big players in the trade market. We just go get what we get. And it doesn't generally affect the price based on the projects we do. So that's good news for anybody working with small communities or with businesses, because they generally cannot influence a price. They will just take what price is given, so we won't have to worry about it. So fortunately, there's not a lot of questions on this homework, but you can kind of see now why this course tries to incorporate all these economic impacts, because it really does matter when you're talking about winners and losers. And a lot of what we see in the world today really is some long-term economic impacts. When we say the rich get richer and the poor gets poorer, a lot of that is really due to the economics of it. Once you're a resource owner, excuse me, once you're a resource owner, then things are built in. Inflation is built in. You can charge more for your rental property. That's all accounted for. But when you don't own resources, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult to take care of these sorts of price increase problems. So this is why we really need to worry about projects that benefit the poor, and we really need to worry about social justice. Because it's going to get worse. And particularly as we start to train people up from those minimum wage to the first tier, when you get to the first tier, that's going to be the type of jobs where it's easy to train them up and it's easy to get in a situation where you have a lot of supply. But to get them to the top tier, like to the boardrooms, super expensive, super difficult. And they may not have the access to those sorts of training programs or training situations. So that's really, I think, where the impact really needs to be investigated on how to move them past just the 6-month training programs, really more into a more in-depth, well-rounded, even leadership, networking, education, all those sorts of things. Because without that, you're going to be stuck at the labor market that we just looked at, where you're just going to do some training and you increase the supply of skilled, but not enough to really have them move up, continue to move up, up, up. And that's really what's causing the problem. This is why we have no minorities on boards. This is really what we need to get around, is around that long-term high-level rise in your job. So that's all I have. Does anyone have any questions? I know it's a lot to absorb. Fortunately, the assignments are really easy, but I think you kind of see that it's a little bit more complex than you thought it was, because we think more is better, but for who? And how did we get more? And what impact does it really have? So that's something we really have to think about. And for economists, of course, we don't get that intimidated by these curves, but for your average citizen, it's quite complex, because we don't really know where these curves even are. We're always estimating them. So it becomes a bit difficult. So I think it's going to be very challenging as we look ahead to try and solve some of the social disparity. And I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but I spent a lot of time thinking about it. So hopefully your generation will do more thinking about it and figure out a way to make it happen, so we have more equity in our social system. Okay, anyone has questions? I'm sure it's a little over.
I'm curious, because we were talking about unions and stuff. I'm curious your thoughts on like student unions, graduate student unions, and kind of this movement where you'll see graduate students striking and stuff like that to get sick leave or whatever, or higher pay, and like how that relates to what we were just talking about.
You know, again, I can see why graduate students need more power. I'm just going to tell you that in my personal opinion, I think they are taken advantage of a lot. So I like to see them get more power. I think the reason why they're in this less powerful position than they used to be, when I was in school, there weren't a lot of graduate students. I literally was, you know, just wrote my ticket, no problem. What we're having now is a lot of people wanting to go to graduate school. And I think this has really resulted in them having a less powerful position. So I think they do need to organize. I think the problem, though, is, and you must feel it if you're in, particularly getting PhDs. When in my day, I never had to do postdocs. I went right to a job. But you may have people that sit in postdocs for 15 years. And I often wonder if they would have been better off to, I mean, I guess they like their jobs, but I see them working really long hours, a lot of credit going to the supervising professor. Also, some of them will never make it if they're not in big labs. So I think they do need power. I'm in support of them organizing, because I think they get taken advantage of. But I think the problem is, it may be, do we really need PhDs to do some of these jobs? I'm not sure. I'm thinking that we like to go to school, but I'm not sure that it's really translating into jobs. So that's what I'm kind of worried about. We seem to be oversupplying graduate students if so many of them are languishing in postdocs, and we're moving to teaching with ancillary faculty that don't really make much money. That's kind of what I'm worried about. I think they do need to, they need to organize somehow, but I think they're also having problems later after they graduate, that it's hard for them to find good jobs and they're being taken advantage of. That's really what I'm more concerned about, is their long-term ability to support themselves. Because if you spend 20 years in, I mean, some of these people are in postdocs for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. That's not high, all the time they spent getting trained. I'm wondering, is there another way we could go about it? I'm not sure, but I don't have a problem with organizing. I think they kind of have to because they're powerless. But the problem is after they get the degrees, then what happens? That's really what I'm more concerned about. I hate to see PhDs driving cabs. I would like to see them put to better uses because they must be very bright people. So that's what I'm kind of worried about. Are they having any success organizing? I haven't seen a lot of success either.
I don't follow too closely, but yeah, I haven't seen much success. So
they don't have much power. That's the problem. You know, what are they going to do? Go on strike? I mean, that's hard to imagine. Although what will probably give them more power is this international student thing where they're not coming here anymore, or where that pool is going down. Because if you're going to foreign countries, a lot of them, like China, would love to come here. So you have someone else willing to step in if you're wanting to go on strike. They'll come in because they really want to get out of China and experience the US because they do value US degrees. But I think they just don't have a lot of power. So I don't know what you do. I mean, you go on strike, but you kind of need that assistantship. Otherwise, this operation to get a PhD is so incredibly expensive, isn't it? I mean, I never had to pay for it, so I didn't ever worry. But if you have to pay tuition, it is really expensive. So I feel like once they get the offer, it's very hard for them to say no. And then when they do have a complaint, it's my experience, I tell them never to complain because no one listens to them. They're kind of expendable. So I feel really bad about that. And I also feel really bad when they spend years and years and years never making any money. And then they're 45 and how are they going to save for retirement? It's very hard. It's this cost of being educated has gone up quite a bit. So I'm very concerned about it. I just don't know what to be done about it. And in Hawaii, I think it's a problem. A lot of people don't come because we can't pay enough. It's controlled. It's a union, so we have steps and it's all controlled what you can pay. And now I think they're going to start making the faculty pay the tuition out of their grants. So that's going to even impact it more, on top of the fact grants are going to start drying up because there's not going to be any money because of the debt problems that we're bringing in due to the pandemic. So it's very interesting. I know it doesn't sound like a super positive picture, but it is something that affects everything. So it's a tough one. Anyone has any more questions or comments? Okay, well, I don't think the bridge example is the first problem. We went through it completely. It's a very simple one. The next one, you have to make up your own numbers. Feel free to make up whatever you want. I'm just gonna look that you follow the procedure. I don't care what numbers you make up, assume whatever you want, because a professional economist would go figure this all out and they would just assume away everything. You just make an assumption, off you go, get a number, justify it. That's what we do. I'm just concerned that you understand that we have to worry about, if we produce more stuff, prices may change, and we have to worry about how that affects the community because it's a distributional problem. Okay, well, we're going to end then. So keep working away. It's ending fast, yay. And keep me posted if you, Emma, I think maybe, did you turn something in? I think I might have saw a star by your box, but I didn't check it today. So I'll check.
Yes, yeah.
I'll check it. I didn't get an email from you, but I thought I was there yesterday and I thought I saw a star, but I was doing something else and then I forgot to go back. So,
cool.
Okay, everybody. Later, tomorrow, I guess. Bye.
Bye.